Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm very excited to kick off the first panel. I have, first of all, just a little bit of housekeeping rules. So we have a special technology app where you can vote, send us your questions. I have a special iPad where I can see them all. Welcome to the forum. This is, first of all, you have to connect to the OECD hotspot with your smartphone. Then go to the website app.ysembly.com. Use the keyword OECD Blue to access this interactive platform. You can post messages, answer the polls. So we have a couple of polls coming your way, but anything that you want asked also to one of the ministers, please just put it on there and then we'll get to it straight away. So I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. The first session is structural reforms to unlock investment in support of sustainable growth. So I'd like to introduce Minister Kyung Hwan Choi. Thank you so much, sir. He is the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Strategy and Finance for Korea. Jason Furman, Chairman of Council for the Economic Advisors of the US. Mr. Henk Kamp, Minister of Economic Affairs from the Netherlands. Maria Luisa Albuquerque, Minister of State and Finance of Portugal. Luis Videgaray, the Minister of Finance and Public Credit from Mexico. And finally, we have Mr. Luis de Guindos, the Minister of Economy and Competitiveness from Spain. So thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to start what we heard from the Secretary General, Mr. Gurria, about their growth forecast. They've cut them to 3.1% this year. And is this not the new normal? If you look at how the world is growing, the crisis that we've gone, we just need to get used to levels more like this. Mr. de Guindos.
Well, I don't think that this is the new normal. You know, in every projection, you have a silver lining, and in this case, well, the silver lining has been the projection about Spain that has been revised up by the OECD to something close to 3%. No? And I think that you know, the main reason why this revision of the growth projection lies in the implementation of structural reforms. That's the point that I would like to make. Why today Spain is leading the pack in terms of growth in the Eurozone, when only 3 years ago, well, we were one of the main problems of the Eurozone. And I think that you know, the real point and the real reason behind is the implementation of structural reforms. And I would like to make only 2 points, 2 very brief points. The first one is that structural reform is not only about enhancing growth potential in the medium term. It's about also improving confidence. I think that one of the most important elements in the recent evolution of the Spanish economy is the evolution of confidence, and structural reform can have an impact on confidence. And you know, the second point is that through a structural reform, you can improve also the transmission mechanisms of fiscal and monetary stimuli. And I think that this is important. In the case of Spain, what we have seen is that the monetary measures taken by the ECB and you know, the fiscal policy consolidation effects have started to produce fruits in terms of the real economy. So these are 2 points. I think that this is not the new normal. I think that there is a clear correlation between the degree of implementation of structural reforms and the relative performance of the different economies. And in my view, that's the real point.
Mr. Minister, yes. Sorry, Minister Choi will speak with a translation. So if you could get your headphones, I think they're on the left of your seats.
Yeah. 이 헤드폰을 끼게 불편을 끼쳐서 죄송합니다. 조금 전에 우리 스페인 장관님께서 구조개혁의 중요성을 말씀을 해주셨습니다. 저도 구조개혁의 중요성에 대해서는 전적으로 공감을 합니다만은 지금 현재 세계 경제 상황.
I'm so sorry. Can I make sure that everybody has a translation?
예,
So, with regards to the world economic situation right now, again, versus what we had initially expected, I do believe that there is a slower than expected recovery, whether we are going to regard this as the new normal or whether we should see it as the crisis not yet being over. I think there needs to be some more thought to that issue, whether it's the new normal versus the crisis not being over. So at the OECD today, I think that there has been a announcement on the revised economic outlook. How I think that versus the initial outlook, I think there has been adjustment downward of around 0.3% points. And in addition to that, if you look at other organizations like the IMF, I do believe that their outlook is also similar. So in terms of the trends. So I believe, in my view, I think that rather than it being a new norm, I think it's more that we have not yet fully overcome the economic crisis in terms of what we look and see in the trends right now. In particular, if you look at the world economy in terms of the biggest risks we face going forward, I believe it would be that, in particular, if you look at the major economies, to overcome the crisis, we have seen unprecedented, first time in history type of interest rates in terms of the policies. For example, in the US, in Japan, in the EU, for these three major economic zones, we can see across the board that there are zero interest rates in these markets. So this, in terms of situations, is an unprecedented event or unprecedented environment. And in terms of overcoming the crisis, as mentioned by Ms. Mann, Catherine Mann before, I think that quantitative easing, also, printing a lot of money and liquidity and putting it into the market, that accounts for 50% of GDP. This is the volume and the magnitude of what we are seeing. I think the issue now is that in terms of the side effects, how are we going to get back to a more normal situation without, going through any side effects or any repercussions? So I think that that is the biggest challenge that we face at this juncture. So if at the OECD level, if we're able to go back to a normal transition path, and if you're able to guide us in that manner, I think that for Secretary General Gurria, I don't think that, everyone will think that, the third term was the most successful term that you've had. So, I would hope and wish that takes place. So in that aspect, of course, the world economy, I think that overcoming the crisis, the very unexceptional measures that we have put in, and also the path back to normalization is something that is unprecedented. So how we actually go through that process is, I believe, if we're not able to get it right, then I think for the world economy, we might face another bigger challenge going forward. So in this situation, rather than seeing this as the new normal, I think that we're still trying to overcome the aftermath of the crisis. And I do believe that we need to go through a more organized transition back to normal. And if we're not able to do that, then we may face a bigger crisis than what we saw in 2008.
I'd like to go to a poll, actually, because we have great panelists that are also from different regions of the world. So which region do you think will drive growth over 2015, 2016? USA, Europe, Japan, or China and the emerging economies? If you tap in your answers, then we'll get to them very, very shortly. Mr. Vidagurai, one question, which the Deputy Prime Minister was alluding to, is, of course, how do we exit QE and what impact the Fed raising interest rates will have on emerging economies? Is it something that you worry about?
Thank you very much. And let me just say that this is not the new normal, and it shouldn't be the new normal. The crisis that happened in the world in 2008 and 2009, it was definitely different from other recessions. So the damage to the balance sheets of companies, governments, and families was much deeper, and particularly confidence was hurt. So what Luis de Guindos was saying a moment ago, that both macro economic policies on the demand side and structural reforms should definitely be confidence builders. And that is the way that we will eventually go to the new normal, to go back to normal. And particularly, we cannot be in the new normal if monetary policy remains where it is. So normalization still is going to be a major challenge, particularly for emerging economies. For emerging economies, we're basically past the days of abundant liquidity, availability of cheap capital, and high commodity prices. So we're facing a new reality where we need to adapt. And only those economies that have strong, credible macro frameworks and structural reform processes will be successful. In Mexico, we're growing in the first quarter 2.5%, which is remarkable in the face of falling oil prices. We are an oil producer, and also in the face of what happened in the U.S. in the first quarter, which is our major, most important trading partner. And the reason why we're growing is because of structural reforms that are having an impact in our domestic demand. The number of cars sold in the first 5 months of the year in the domestic market are 20% higher than last year. So it's the consumer that today is driving the recovery. And one of the reasons is that structural reforms are already having an effect in the economies of families. For instance, the telecommunications reform that we did a couple of years ago has reduced 10% the prices of internet access and mobile telephones for both companies and families. And that is having already an impact in domestic demand. But again, in the face of increasing interest rates, we don't know when the Fed will do that, how will they do it, but they will do it. We all know that it's going to happen eventually, and perhaps sooner rather than later. We need to be prepared, and the best way to do it is to sustain a credible macroeconomic framework and again, do structural reforms. And that's what we've been doing over the past 2 years in Mexico.
Thank you. Jason Furman, we talk about the Fed day in, day out, and the impact that it has on the rest of the world. When's the ideal time?
The ideal time is something that the Federal Reserve will figure out without any comment from the Obama administration. But I'll take that as an invitation to answer whatever it is I wanted to answer, which is, I think, the economic outlook was a really good piece of work this year, and I commend Catherine Mann, the Secretary General, for doing it. And I think what it really pointed out is that supply and demand, there's a lot of, do you do things on the demand side, you do things on the supply side, are really closely linked. And if you look at productivity growth, I know in the United States, the problem we've had in the last couple of years isn't in total factor productivity, it isn't in the innovativeness of the US economy. Everyone sees how extraordinary that is. It lets us do such amazing things as polls while we're all talking about which country is going to drive the global economy. The problem we've had has been investment, has been insufficient. And when we've done our own analytics about why that is, they come up with a very similar answer to what the OECD came up with, which is that private investment follows aggregate demand. And the more demand you have, the more reason there is for businesses to make investments. They need a reason to make investments. They need to know the consumers are going to be there buying their products, and if they're not, there's less reason for them to invest. Now, where does that extra demand come from? You asked me a question about monetary policy. That's one place. It also comes from fiscal policy. So if you expand public investment, you invest more in infrastructure, that creates more demand. More demand actually creates more private investment, and so you can have more public investment and more private investment, have both of them together, and that remedies a lot of the problems that we've seen with productivity growth. The last thing I'd highlight, though, is it's not just this overall demand and the quantity of investment that matters. We really need to care about the quality of that investment. You don't want to build office towers in the middle of nowhere with no one to occupy them. You're not going to get, you may get short-run demand from that. You're not going to get long-run growth from that. And I think that's where a lot of the reforms come in. In the case of the United States, I think business tax reform is particularly important so that you're not having investment decisions being made for tax reasons. You're investing in the things that are most productive for the underlying economy as a whole. So I think, public investment is a key to unlocking stronger growth, which is a key to unlocking private investment. And then we need to make sure that private investment is channeled well. Businesses normally do a good job of making that decision on their own. We have to make sure we're not distorting that decision with our policies, including our tax policies.
All right, Mr. Furman, thank you. Minister Albuquerque, what's your biggest concern for Europe, aside from Greece, which we'll get onto in a second?
Thank you. Well, in Europe, there are, I would have different concerns because the issues we've been discussing here on how important structural reform is, it is also important when we hear these discussions on what are the drivers for investment, what will be pushing investment, particularly private investment, and how relevant is aggregate demand. Then, in order to communicate this to people in a proper way, we need to make sure that we make clear that when we say that aggregate demand is a driver for investment, we are not saying that smaller countries with more fragile fiscal positions should stimulate aggregate demand, because we've seen that mistake in 2010, thinking that one size fits all and that the same medicine would necessarily result in a cure for everyone, and the result wasn't good. So part of the challenges that we face now is how to pass on the messages to people. We say, and we all agree, that confidence is key. So we need to have consistent messages, and we need to make people understand first, why are structural reforms important? They are politically difficult because they have usually short-term costs and medium to long-term benefits. And to make people understand why are the costs necessary, why are they worthwhile, looking for a slightly more into the future and the benefits that will come is a main challenge and is necessarily a pillar for confidence, which will then have all the positive effects. So the message, how do we explain to our population that the policies that we are defending and implementing are the right ones because they are the ones with better results, is key. That requires a coordinated message, both from national politicians, and in our case, European politicians. The message must be very consistent. But I would say that the risk that we would face is, as we see things improving, that we become complacent. That would clearly be a risk. It is very tempting to want to give good news only. And that is obviously very nice. We politicians also like to give good news, though finance ministers are not necessarily among that lot. We don't get to give good news very often. But it is important to maintain a firm anchor so that we do not lose what we have already conquered. We need to continue to build, but never losing sight of the lessons learned from this crisis. And risks of complacency being presented among the need to restore and promote confidence are a real danger. So that's what I would worry at this stage.
Thank you. Minister Kemp, what's your take actually on the new normal, and how do we get out of this B- into something better? Let's get an A+.
I agree with my colleagues that the structural reforms, they are the key. My colleague of Mexico said so, my colleague of Spain. And I think structural reforms, they are the key. The countries that realize structural reforms, they are the proof. I think
We can get back to you, Minister. I'll give you a couple of seconds. You're okay.
I'm ready, thank you very much. So I said that I think that structural reforms are the key. And countries like Ireland and United Kingdom and Spain and perhaps Mexico and Germany in the past, they are the proof. And I think the structural reforms, they start with financial reforms. The crisis was organized, was started in the financial sector. So we had to restructure the financial sector. We had to bring public finances on the sustainable path, and we had to improve finance to businesses, especially SMEs. But that is the beginning. After that, it was necessary to reform housing markets, to reform labor markets, to reform the care and the cure, because we have aging societies and the costs are rising every year. And we have to reform our pension systems. In the Netherlands, we realized all those reforms. Our pension age at the moment is 67 years old. And as a result of all these reforms, they are positive results now for the country already. We have a productivity growth of 1%. We have an economic growth of 2% or even a little bit more this year, next year. We have a growth of investment of 7%. So that makes the difference. And I think that if we are able to realize structural reforms, then the results will be there.
Minister, thank you. I wanted to see if we actually had the results from the poll, because I couldn't see them if you already answered all of them, to see whether you think that the US, Europe, Japan, or some of the emerging economies would drive global growth, if we can get that up for you. And in the meantime, Minister Choi, I was going to ask you all what your biggest concern for the world economy is, and whether, Minister Choi, you're concerned about currency wars. Are you worried about currency wars?
아까 제가 이 말씀을 드릴
So before, when I talked, I think that when we talked about overcoming the economy, how are we going to actually normalize from the monetary policies of before to a normal state without any hiccups? I think that that is one of the biggest homeworks that we face within the global economy. And in that aspect, I do believe that in the case of the US, a rise in rates there, or in Japan and in the Eurozone, we see quantitative easing taking place. But the impact on the global financial sector, I do believe that in the case of emerging markets, there could be big impacts in terms of the forecast going forward. So in the situation that if we continue to have a fragile recovery and the advanced economies, if we have monetary and fiscal policy, if there were to be bigger negative implications, then I do believe that there could be an increase in vulnerabilities in the emerging markets. So in that aspect, I do believe that very organized and very cooperative, well-cooperated transition is required for us to avoid such a situation from taking place. As mentioned before from the OECD, that is why we look to the OECD to set forth a good transition path for us. So in that case, for example, that would be that, a lot of people will think that Secretary Gurria in his third term is doing a very successful job, and, it's good that he is here. And in addition to that, with regards to weak investment, I think that this is a concern that everyone shares. And in terms of the diagnosis, the reasons for that, I think that there's a lot of consent in this room. However, why is investment very weak? I think that there could be the areas that we have not thought of. For example, if you look at the capital cost right now, financing costs are almost zero in terms of, because there's so much liquidity without the market, we have an abundance of liquidity. And in such a situation, why are we not seeing investments? Well, there could be uncertainties, there could be confidence issues, there could be a wide range of answers to that. But I think that it might be an issue of oversupply. And I think that this is something that we may want to think about. If we look at the pre-crisis situation at that time in terms of property markets, in terms of commodities, and in terms of various other areas, I do believe that there was a lot of overinvestment that took place during that phase of time. And I do believe that that may be an issue of why we see less investment taking place right now. So I think that that is a factor that may be given some thought. And added to that, there's also the population or changes in terms of an aging society. I do believe that changes in demographics is also leading to changes in patterns. So if we were to invest as we did in the past, I think that a lot of companies recognize that my goods may not sell as well as they did in the past because of aging in society. So these factors, I do believe, do need to take into consideration when we talk about investment. For example, an oversupply situation, whether that is a factor. In addition to that, as we face an aging society, whether that is having an impact on investment is also considerations that we need to take into consideration when we discuss this issue.
Who's concerned about asset bubbles? Because one way to unlock investment is to have more confidence. And if people think there are asset bubbles around the world, then investment is going to be held back. Anyone? Who worries about Greece on a daily basis? Jason, how is it going to be resolved?
You'll have to ask some of the Europeans that. But I think 90% of our worries are about long-run productivity. I think that swamps everything else. But 90% of what we know how to do something about is the short-run problems we face. And I thought the economic outlook, to go back to it, did a good job. I think I think Greece is, as Secretary Liu said, a potential accident. And the solution there, I think, is conceptually straightforward. It's something that would be in the interests of all the parties. It's clear the Greeks need to do more than they've done to date. But it's an accident that I think would be a mistake to think would just be contained to Greece. The risks and spillovers, just like we thought, subprime would be contained to that market and wouldn't spill over to the rest of the U.S. economy, the global economy. That was badly wrong. We don't want to make that type of mistake again in thinking that a risk was contained. So I think Greece, in the case of the United States, avoiding fiscal brinksmanship. In the case of some other countries, some of these short-run threats to a recovery that's not all the way there are, eminently solvable. We know exactly how to solve them. Once we do that, we can put our attention to, I think, the big question, which is productivity growth over the medium and long run.
Thank you. Let me just go back to the question on currency wars concern. I'm not that concerned about that. I think that today the, exchange rates are more market-driven than in the past. I'm more concerned about protectionism and policies that go against free trade as a response to impatience in how how growth is evolving. I think that is a real threat. I'm also very concerned about populism, and that also arises out of impatience. Structural reforms, and I totally agree, are a difficult political process because the costs are heavily front-loaded and the benefits come in time. And we see it around the world, that populism, which offers simple solutions to a very impatient population, are a significant threat to the world economy, to long-term productivity, but also to the recovery of the economy. And because I don't have a mobile device in my hand, I cannot vote on your question. So I will just say it out loud. I think that the fastest growing region in the world for the next 10 years is going to be North America. Based on the demographics, the energy availability, and the flexibility and innovation capacity of the U.S. economy, I think North America has the best prospects in the next. North America has the best prospects, and of course, free trade in the region has the best prospect for doing that. And I didn't say that. Something I didn't say in my first participation. I just want to congratulate Angel Gurria for his as a fellow Mexican, and we are all very proud of you, and congratulations for that.
Can I second the motion on North America and Angel Gurria?
And actually, the poll, I think the poll has the U.S. as the second biggest driver. I think it's emerging markets as first. I can't really see, but is it 100% the U.S.? Let's go back to Greece. Mr. De Guindos.
Well, before going to Greece, I would like to make some comments on the evolution of currency markets and exchange rate markets. First of all, I think that the recent evolution and the depreciation of the euro and other currencies vis-à-vis the dollar is a natural phenomenon, it's a natural effect. My perception is that there is not any sort of manipulation, and I think that this is quite relevant. Also, my perception is that we have almost reached a level of equilibrium in the currency markets, and that this new equilibrium is going to rebalance the growth of rates in the different areas of the world. And well, for instance, if I would have to vote in your panel, I would say that perhaps the surprise in 2015 and 2016 is going to be Europe, despite Greece, and afterwards we will discuss about Greece. My impression is that we are going to bridge the gap in terms of growth vis-à-vis the United States. That was something that was quite evident last year. And you can see, for instance, that in 2015, well, we had some very positive news in the first quarter coming from Europe. The growth rate in the first quarter on quarter, was 0.4. We have a positive surprise with France. The growth rate was 0.6. Italy left the recession behind with an acceptable growth rate of 0.3 that I think that is going to improve over time. And in the case of Spain was 0.9, and so in the case of Portugal. So we had a positive surprise in the first quarter of the year that I think that is going to linger over the next quarters. There is one aspect that I would like to raise that perhaps it was mentioned by Luis before, but perhaps it's something that is important in order to understand the evolution of the world economy, at least in certain countries, is private debt. Why? Despite the fact that we have a very expansionary monetary policy, quantitative easing, fiscal policy is much more accommodative than it was in the past. Well, this is not producing an effect. And I think that perhaps, sometimes we have to take into consideration that the level of debt of the private sector, both families and non-financial corporations, is extremely high. They are extremely geared. And despite the fact that, you put in place all the traditional aggregate domestic demand policies, you do not obtain any sort of impact on consumption and investment, because the majority of the agents in the private sector, both families and non-financial corporations, they are deleveraging. And deleveraging produces very, depressive effects on global demand. That's why I think that perhaps we should start to try to pay more attention, for instance, to insolvency regimes in order to accelerate the process of deleveraging. It's important to keep an eye on the situation of the banking industry, but I think that perhaps this is the kind of structural reform that we should pay a little bit more attention.
But Minister, you're the poster child of reforms that have been successful so far, and at the moment you have the confidence of investors. How does it make you feel that we seem to be playing with fire, right, on not finding an accord with Greece? Are we going to get something in the 11th hour?
No, but I am totally sure that we will reach an agreement with Greece. I am totally sure. The Eurozone is, a club, a monetary union, where you can check in, but you cannot check out. You have to respect. You have to respect, the rules. Everybody, we are, in the same boat. We have certain rules, and I think that the important point with respect to Greece is to have a comprehensive list of reforms to make Greece grow again. That's the key point. I am not in the loop of the negotiations, but my impression, my personal perception, is that we will be able to reach an agreement that will be extremely beneficial either for Greece or the rest of the Eurozone.
Minister Albuquerque, do you share that optimism? And what will it do to growth in Europe if we don't get an agreement?
If I may, Francine, I would like to go back to your original question on the biggest concerns on the world economy. And I would, to complement what my colleagues have said, I would say that rising inequality in general, not just in the distribution of income, but also in different trends. It was mentioned here before how relevant is the challenge of aging. But aging is a problem of part of the world, and a significant part of the world still has a very dynamic demographic situation with a lot of young people, so the challenges are different. And these inequalities in the distribution of income, but also in demographic trends, and the pressure that it imposes, the issues of migration flows, how do we deal with this? And how does that affect the political equilibriums around the world? What is the impact in rising populism and other manifestations of reduced democracy around the world? And that can be a huge threat to the world economy, because it can really mean that we will have very difficult situations ahead. And even when we look outside Europe, very close to our borders, we see very worrying situations which can have a major impact in the economic outlook. And also that has to do significantly with inequality. We live in a globalized world, which means that everyone around the world, or most people, have information and perception of different ways of living. And that makes it very acute for people to understand how different it is to be born in a rich country, in a poor country, in the upper class or in the lower class. And it makes these differences very obvious to everyone. This is a huge challenge that requires global cooperation and a major threat, not only to the economic perspectives, but to how we envisage the world going forward in general. So this is obviously too broad a topic to have in such a short discussion. On the issues of the challenges in Europe and how do we view, I think that honestly, to be at this precise moment speculating on the outcome of negotiations, ongoing negotiations, which may be concluded today, tomorrow, very, very, very shortly. I think we are all doing a huge effort to see those negotiations with Greece coming to a positive conclusion. We all believe, I also think that Greece does, Greece and the Eurozone and the rest of Europe, that an agreement is definitely the best possible solution. We need to find a way which is acceptable for both parts, knowing that it involves maybe crossing some lines, and that may be necessary, and again, is a bit like structural reforms. Even if it has a short-term costs, you need to look a little beyond and see the longer-term advantages of these decisions. But I don't think that continuing to discuss around different scenarios at this stage makes that much sense. So let's those people who are at the heart of the negotiations do their best, and when called, we will be there to support the decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Minister Kemp, what do you worry about more when you look at global growth, productivity or unemployment?
Unemployment is always a result of a productivity problem. And I think that for us, as the representatives of the governments, for us as policymakers, it's important to see what we can do ourselves. The problem in our countries is not that there are no funds available. There's plenty of money. The problem is not that there is no knowledge available. There is knowledge. The problem is also not that there are no good ideas of the companies. There are plenty of good ideas of the companies. But it's our task as the governments to make better use of it and to create combinations. And we try to do so in our country. Let me give you a few examples. We have saved a lot of money in our country for the pensions, 1.5 trillion euros for the pensions, and it's safeguarded by the pension funds and by the insurance companies. But the insurance companies and the pension funds, they want to invest also in our own country, but the country is small, the projects in our country are small, and they are looking for big projects in the world. Is what we did together with the pension funds and the insurance companies is create a kind of intermediary. The pension funds and the insurance companies created the intermediary themselves, and they themselves collect projects in our country. They prepare the projects, make them available for the funds and for the insurance companies, and so make it possible for them to invest in our own country. The second thing what we are doing is organizing innovation cooperation, because we think that the big decisions about innovation should be taken by the companies, and the government should support. And that's why we organized cooperation between the local government, regional government, national government, knowledge institutions, universities, and the companies. And the companies are in the lead. They take the decisions, they make the roadmaps, they decide about supporting innovation. And that creates an atmosphere that the companies believe in stability of policy. They believe in the environment for their decisions, and they are prepared to invest. And that's also one of the reasons that the investments in our country grew this year with 6-7%. And the third thing that we should do, we are doing it in the Netherlands, but we also should do it on the international level, is create a new regulatory system, new regulatory institutions, and new rules, because it's all focused on the existing situation, the existing companies, but the growth, the new jobs, they are coming from new companies like Uber and companies like B&B. They don't fit in the existing rules and existing institutions. So we should make digital proof regulation that gives opportunity to new companies to come with new ideas and to create new jobs.
Thank you, Minister. I'm going to take a couple of questions from the floor. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and we'll come to you very shortly because we have microphones. The gentleman on the third row.
Yep. I'm Euclid Sakalotos. I'm a minister from Greece for International Economic Affairs. I would like to ask the panelists whether they think there might be some dissonance with some of the things that the General Secretary said about efficiency and growth and the negotiations currently going on in Greece. After all, we're being asked to reduce pensions and reduce social spending, so much for the social inclusion and inequality. We're being asked to prioritize reform in the structural side of liberalizing bakers, pharmacists, and so on, rather than the important issues about how the rich have not paid in Greece traditionally, tax evasion, and so on. And thirdly, we've been asked to increase our primary surpluses, not to have so low primary surpluses, which will have a great effect on investment. And finally, and this is the key thing, unless Grexit is removed from the agenda, unless there is a final solution, something to do with debt, something to do investment, Greece will never grow out of this crisis. We'll always be going hand to mouth to what we have to face, and we will not be able to even do the fiscal targets we're being given, because obviously we won't grow if Grexit is not taken off the agenda, and then the IMF and the others will come back and say why you need to do more, and so on. So I think there is a great dissonance from what we heard in the morning and the negotiations as they're currently being taken in Greece at the moment.
Minister de Guindos.
Well, I think that they have made very clear that Grexit is not on the table, it's off the radar screen. No, that's very clear, and that we are in the same boat, and that we are looking for, a cooperative solution for everybody. No, as Maria Luisa Albuquerque has said, well, we are not in the loop yet of the negotiation. The different institutions will have to come out with a list of reforms that will come to the Eurogroup, and for sure, as Maria Luisa has said, that we will have a constructive and cooperative approach. I think that the main point is, and I think that this is vital, we do not want to impose any sort of conditionality to Greece per se. What we want to do is to have a list of reforms that pushes up the growth rate of Greece. In the past, we have shown several times flexibility, and this has been a reality, and I think that we are totally open to show this flexibility in the future. There are rules that we have to respect, but I think that the main goal of everybody is to make Greece grow again. That's our target, and if we do not achieve that goal, I think that everybody is going to fail.
Minister Vidaray.
I don't know if this is related to Greece or not, but let me just share with you what we've learned in Mexico over the past few decades. The most damaging events to poverty in Mexico, to income inequality, and to the well-being of Mexicans have been the financial collapses that we went through in 76, 82, and then again in 95. And these were financial collapses when global markets lost faith in the Mexican economy, and we had massive exits of capital. And it took years to recover, and in many ways, we have not recovered yet from all the damaging effects of that. So the thing we've learned, and this is perhaps the main difference between policy making in an emerging economy vis-a-vis a developed economy, is that the emerging markets, emerging economies need to earn credibility every day. And that is perhaps the most important priority. And that's why in the face of accidents that can happen, either be things that going on in Greece or a normalization of monetary policy going not as smooth as predicted, or anything that can happen in the world, emerging markets need to be prepared through structural reforms, but also through a credible macroeconomic policy going forward.
Thank you. On the specific question of Greece and the perception of us being dissonant, that's maybe I didn't explain myself well, but that's exactly what I meant before by saying that it's not one size fits all. And when we say it's necessary to stimulate demand because that drives investment, that is not necessarily a recipe to be followed by everyone. I have the example of my own country, who clearly overdid it in 2010 and led to a crisis which we are still getting out of. And indeed, in a very short period of time, has caused a major deterioration of an already fragile situation. So there is no necessary inconsistency when we talk about what is needed in a global level or at an aggregated level, and the need of specific reforms or measures to be implemented in one specific country. Of course, there is clearly the difficulty in the message, because in order to be successful in any of the strategies, people need to understand why things are done, what is the justification to do particularly difficult measures. And there, the communication, the political sensitivity of many of these communications is obviously key. But to say that in general we need to stimulate demand because that drives growth is not the same as saying that in every specific country you need to stimulate demand. Because the truth is that not every specific country has a strong enough position to be able to support that, especially if the fiscal situation is fragile and if the economic imbalances are too big. So it is important to make the message very clear that when it is said at the OECD level, at the European level, whatever aggregated level you can consider, that aggregate demand is key, or that 1% increase in domestic demand leads to 1% increase in investment, that is not true for specific economies on their own, especially small open economies in integrated markets and with no monetary policy, independent monetary policy. So it is very important that the message is transmitted. Do not hear this as one size fits all, otherwise you will see inconsistencies that, in my view, do not necessarily exist. Thank you.
If I could maybe take you up on that point a little bit. I do agree, obviously one size doesn't fit all, and different countries have different fiscal situations and different sizes. But it's also the case that every single OECD economy except one currently has an output gap, is operating below its potential according to the OECD's numbers. And I think one of the important lessons you had there was you can get aggregate demand not just from a larger budget deficit, you can get it from changing the composition of your spending. You can get it from changing the balance of your spending and revenues. You can also get it from changing your intertemporal balance. So you run a larger deficit over the next year or two, you combine that with fiscal consolidation over the medium and long run, and you've actually improved your fiscal situation in the sense that it matters most, which is in some present value over a longer period of time, while changing the timing of it. So, there's different sets of tools in terms of fiscal policy, but I don't think it's a, yes, you have it, no, you have no ability to do it. There's a lot of different ways to do fiscal policy that'll vary based on your constraints, based on your situation. All of that being said, I think even, in terms of classic fiscal policy, certainly not every single country in the OECD, but you look at where long-term interest rates are, and I think there's probably a lot of countries that have, more space even for classic fiscal policy than you might previously have thought. But even if you don't think that, there's a lot of fiscal tools that aren't just budget deficits.
Thank you. We are almost out of time, so I'm going to ask just one last question to Minister Choi. You've implemented reforms on 4 pillars. What is the one reform that you think the world needs in the next 12 months? Just one reform.
지금
So in order for the world economy to recover, of course, in terms of structural reform, I think that everyone agrees that this is required. And of course, from the Korean government, as mentioned before, in 4 areas, which namely would be labor, financial sectors, also the public sector, and also education. In those areas, we are engaging in very strong structural reform. So those are the targets that we have. So in these 4 areas, actually, it is very deeply related to the labor and also capital productivity and improving those productivities. So we believe that those are the 4 essential elements. So therefore, in terms of improving the productivity of labor and capital, we believe that that reform is required for us to be able to stimulate the economy and for us to come closer to our potential growth rate. So in that aspect, as you are probably aware, in terms of structural reform in itself, for us, it's not as easy as everyone says. And of course, there is a lot of political sensitivities, and therefore, without that political commitment, it's very difficult to achieve. So for us, what we believe is very beneficial, or what we're lucky, is that on the public worker pension side, actually, we had a lot of political dispute about how to reform it or whether it was required. But we actually have been able to be very successful in reforming it and getting National Assembly approval for it. In addition to that, one of the areas that we're most focused on is the actually labor market reform. So that would be our top priority. So in Korea right now, one of the most challenging situations that we face, and also the most eminent issues, is labor market reform. So therefore, if we are able to achieve this and be successful in this area, I think that as we have seen in the past, for example, for the past decade within the OECD, actually, we have one of the highest growth rates within the OECD. However, recently, because of various structural issues, our vulnerabilities are emerging. We do believe that if we are successful in labor market reform, then we can get back to the path of momentum going forward. So that is the focus that we have. And of course, we do have the Netherlands minister here, but we also have an agreement with Netherlands that we are benchmarking. And in addition to that, in Germany, the Hartz reform is also something that we are actually looking at also. So in terms of the labor market reform, trying to have more flexibility in the labor market, and in terms of the non-regular workers, providing them with more job security is one of the focuses that we have. However, of course, politically, it's very challenging to make progress on this point. How we can solve this issue will probably be the key to what type of short-term growth we can achieve going forward.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the panel.